begin by welcoming you all to Patrick Marnell's MS thesis defense. I really appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your very hectic schedules at this time of the quarter to share an hour with us. Patrick is finishing up his Master of Science degree, and he's worked on a variety of research projects during his time here, including trying to figure out how to render dense point clouds in our driving simulator lab so we can more accurately represent the real-world environment, as well as studying the implications of flashing yellow arrows on drivers' permissive left-turn behavior. However, today, he's going to talk to us about the implications of distracted driving on efficiency in signalized intersections. With that, I'm going to go ahead and let Pat take it over.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction, David, and thanks to my committee for being here to support me today. Why does driver distraction get so much attention? It's because there's a clear negative impact on the transportation network. Some 3,300 people were killed in 2011 and 100 times that many injured in accidents directly related to distraction. One study showed that only 48% of drivers involved in crashes were identified as attentive at the time of their accident. And just to highlight some of the volume of studies that has been conducted on the topic of driver distraction, McCart reviewed 125 studies just on the safety consequences of cell phone use. So what's interesting, what's unique about all of this research that's going on about distraction is that it focuses on the safety impacts, which are certainly significant. But there's a missing piece, and that's that distraction is also affecting the efficiency of the transportation system. So in this study, I'm going to attempt to use headway as a performance measure to examine the effects of distraction on efficiency at signalized intersections with dual left-turn lanes. As a little outline, first we'll touch on some background, then we'll move on to the data collection methods, analysis, results, a small thought experiment, and then I'll wrap up with a conclusion and some notes on future work. Driving and driver distraction. If we think about the driving task, we can break it into three separate tasks: control, guidance, and navigation. Control is that very basic level of actually physically controlling the vehicle and making it move down the road. Guidance is going to be a step higher than that and involves keeping that road on the path, reacting to stimulus, other traffic, pedestrians, those kind of actions. And then navigation is the highest level task, where you actually plan a trip from point A to point B, select your route, and potentially even adapt that route while in travel. So this driving task is inherently a multitasking assignment. And we know from some human factors research that humans are inherently crummy multitaskers, and that the more tasks we ask any person to do at the same time, the worse their performance becomes in general. So let's define driver distraction as any action that diverts the driver's attention away from the driving task. And further, let's say that it requires an explicit activity. So you have to be actively reaching for something in the passenger seat, or looking at a distracting event outside, or even just daydreaming. But it is somehow different than merely being inattentive. We can classify distractions as a combination of three different distraction types. Manual distractions, where for some reason the driver takes their hands or feet away from the task of driving. Visual distractions, where the driver is drawn to look at some distraction unrelated to the actual task of driving. And then cognitive distractions, where the driver is thinking about a task that is unrelated to driving. I think this cartoon guy is thinking about his sweetheart on his way home from work. But we're also going to want to know that typically these distractions don't fall neatly into a single category. If we think about texting, it's going to be a combination of the manual distraction as you manipulate the phone, the visual distraction as you look at the cell phone, and the cognitive distraction as you compose the message in your head. Next, I'll touch briefly on driver behavior at signalized intersections. If you imagine yourself at a stoplight waiting for the light to turn green, you're about to go through a perception reaction time process. When that light turns green, you're going to have to detect that event, process the information, then make a decision about how to proceed, and then initiate that action. As engineers, we have several estimates that we commonly use for perception reaction time. And these are design estimates, so they're typically conservative values. In an urban area, for a stoplight, we might use 1 second. On a freeway, we might use a 2.5 second to represent the different characteristics between these scenarios. But if we want to talk about an empirically derived value, we're going to need to talk about something more like 0.66 seconds, which comes from a study examining drivers' brake reaction time, a specific type of perception reaction time, when the driver had some expectation of needing to brake. So they're in an alerted state, which if we think about a stoplight is going to be the exact condition we have. Next, we should talk about how we're going to measure headways. Typically, as traffic engineers, we define the headway as being the time between when a common point on two vehicles crosses a fixed object along the side of the road. However, for the first vehicle in the queue, this definition doesn't really work. So we define the headway of the first vehicle as the time between the activation of that green indication and the time when the front axle of that vehicle crosses the stop bar. Then we measure all subsequent headways as we would normally, using the front axle as the common point on the vehicles and the stop bar as the fixed object. If we were to examine the headways we see at a signalized intersection, they would show this trend starting off high and then trending towards a steady value known as the saturation headway. The additional time you see above this saturation headway is due to the effects of the perception reaction time and the need to accelerate. So a definition for this, the sum of this is the startup loss time, and it's just the additional time in seconds consumed by the first few vehicles in a queue at a signalized intersection. And as I've said, this is due to the need to react to that signal change and then accelerate to a steady flow condition. Next, we'll briefly examine the dual left turn lane. Dual left turn lanes are used to provide more capacity for the left turn movement at a signal without increasing the cycle length. And if you imagine having two left turn lanes, you might expect to get twice the capacity. But in practice, we only see an increase by a factor of about 1.8. Additionally, we see evidence that the headways show that same sloping downtrend in relation to queue position. And there's some evidence to show that there are different flow characteristics between the inside and the outside lane. Next, I'll speak on the data collection and methods used in this study. Data was collected at three different cities, Lawrence, Kansas, Corvallis, Oregon, and Logan, Utah. Two intersections were examined in each city, although several of the intersections had multiple approaches with dual left turns, so a total of 11 intersection approaches were examined. High-definition video was used to collect the data with a frame rate of 60 frames per second during daylight hours with prevailing good weather conditions, dry pavement, on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays during the summer of 2010. And this is really just saying that we're collecting data during normal driving conditions. This resulted in a total of 33 hours of video representing 704 cycles with a minimum of 10 hours of video per state for a total of nearly 5,000 drivers sampled. Grad students reduced this data on high-definition video screens and tabulated the following data for each vehicle on the video footage. Although for this study, we'll be focusing on the following variables. Next, we'll speak about the analysis. The data analysis for this project was performed using RStudio, although some of the supplemental figures were created with Microsoft Excel. It was decided that we would only look at the vehicles in the first 5 queue positions because that's where the interesting interactions are going to be occurring. This did, however, reduce our data sample size to only about 4,200 observations. Next, we created several preliminary data visualizations and prepared the data for linear regression. If we looked at the proportions of distracted drivers, we'd see that about 75% of people are doing what they should at that intersection. They're waiting in an undistracted state for the light to change. However, I should note that in our data, we only classify a driver as distracted if they display that distracting behavior within 5 seconds of the onset of the green indication. Over here, you can see the distractions that were observed and how frequently, and also note that some 7% of the drivers we simply couldn't classify for whatever reason. Tinted windows, a bicyclist driving in front of the camera. So there is this set that we don't have a lot of information on. We could also look at the proportion of distractions by state. And I know there's a ton of data on this graph, but it's not going to be on the test. What we want to take away from this slide is that these distractions between states really do show differences. And we did run a proportions test to prove that there are different proportions of distractions between the 3 sites. But the visualization seems the best way in my mind to display that information. Next, if we're going to perform a statistical analysis, we're almost always going to have to talk about the normality of the data. Due to the nature of headways, the raw data does not show a normal distribution. It's all squished towards 0, which is an artifact of how we define headways and is just to be expected with the data. However, if we apply a log transform, we get a much nicer distribution. So if we're going to attempt to predict now that we've done the log transform, median head weight of vehicles, we're going to have to choose what variables we'd like to use. And for this study, we're using distraction, queue position, left turn lane, and state. But what's interesting about these variables is they're all discrete variables. You can't be in queue position 2.37, and you can't be 20% in the state of Oregon. So we're going to have to set use dummy variables with a value of 0 or 1, 0 if that statement is false, 1 if that statement is true. And additionally, we're going to have to set a reference level to compare against. For this analysis, we chose the undistracted driver in the first queue in the outside lane in Kansas as our reference level. And choosing the undistracted driver was a very conscious decision to aid in comparisons between undistracted and distracted drivers, as well as the first queue position being a logical choice to help aid in comparisons. The outside lane in Kansas, those are completely arbitrary. You can pick anything you want, but you have to pick something to perform the analysis. Using this, we come up with this big, long, ugly expression, but remembering that we've assigned, these are all dummy variables, most of these are going to equal 0, and those terms will fall out if you actually had to compute the values. Now that we've settled on this full model, it makes sense to do a little more rigorous evaluation of if this data is suitable for linear regression methods. The QQ plot is another way to examine the normality of the data. And you can see from this nice balance test shape with the majority of the points lying right on this line that we do have a very good fit with the normal distribution. The tails here may be a sign of a heavy distribution, a heavy tailed normal distribution, but it shouldn't pose a significant problem in the regression analysis. Another assumption that we make in using linear regression is that there's an equality of variance in the data. And as you can see from this residual plot, it's a nice symmetrical shape, which shows that we have a relative equality of variance through the data. Again, suitable for linear regression. Next, we want to ensure that no points within the data set are unduly influential on the model. And we use the Cook's distance as a tool to examine this. Typically, a value of 1.0 is used as a cutoff for whether a point is influential or not. And here we've got Cook's distance pointed at 0.5. So you can see that there's no problem with any points being unduly influential. Another consideration we have to make in using linear regression is multicollinearity. Multicollinearity exists when multiple independent variables within the model attempt to explain the same variation in the data. If you were to imagine creating a model to describe the growth of trees, you might have the temperature in there and the month. But all that's saying is that trees grow really well when it's warm and sunny, and those two explain the same information. This ends up in a situation where a small change in the data can result in drastic changes in the estimates of the regression coefficients. Again, we have a tool to assess the multicollinearity of our data, and that's the variance inflation factor. Again, we have a cutoff of about 5 to show that, well, our data is acceptable and does not show signs of multicollinearity. So we've examined our data, and we see strong evidence to suggest that it's a good data set and that we're appropriate and it would be appropriate to apply these linear regression methods to it. So now we can answer some more interesting questions. First of all, does distraction affect the headways? If it doesn't, I'm kind of sunk, so let's hope that it does. And we do this by creating a reduced model without the terms related to distraction. From here, we compare the reduced model to the full model with the null hypothesis that distraction has no effect on headway. Or if you like numbers, that beta 7 through 12 all equal each other, and in addition, all equal 0. When we run this test, we get a very small p-value, leading us to reject our null hypothesis and conclude that one or more of the distractions is a significant factor on predicting those median headways. We could ask the same questions about state, left turn lane, Q position, and we do this in the same method by creating these reduced models and then comparing them to the full models. Each time we get this nice low p-value, leading us to reject our null hypothesis and conclude that these variables are significant in predicting the headway. This leads us to suggest that the full model explains the most variability in the data and is going to be our preferred model for further investigation. The results from this model come in the form of the estimates for the regression coefficients. These values have been exponentiated to account for the log transformation we previously performed on the data. But we will need to make a note about how we interpret this. The intercept contains an estimate for the reference level. So that driver in the undistracted driver in the first Q position in Kansas is estimated at having a median headway of about 2.43 seconds. The rest of our estimates are interpreted as multiplicative factors. So if we wanted to estimate a driver in Oregon in the third Q position in the inside lane, we would take all of those coefficients, multiply them by our initial estimate, and come up with a value. Next, let's take a closer look at what each of our independent variables tell us about the headway. We previously stated that Q position has this well-defined effect on headway. So if we plot our predicted headways, we hope to see that same trend. And we do somewhat, but there's a problem going on with this first data point. It's unexpectedly low. However, there's a logical reason. If you recall the data collection process, we took high-definition video footage, and you can see here that we've got the truck right when the green indication happens, and the truck when it crosses the stop bar line, but you can't actually see the green indication here. How this data was collected was grad students who were filming the intersections actually watched the intersection and yelled out, red light, green light, red light, green light, to introduce a verbal record of the signal timing into the data. What this also introduced was a PRT error into the first, the measurement of the first Q position. So if we were to go back and add that 0.66 seconds, which we think might be a reasonable value for a perception reaction time of a person in an alerted condition, we would see the exact trend we expect. Next, let's take a look at the variable state. We've shown that there is an effect of state in our model, but is that effect actually due to the state? I'm going to say probably not. Although the sites we selected were all relatively similar, they're small cities with large state universities in the western US, We didn't randomly select the data throughout that state or even throughout that city. The sites were convenient for researchers to access. So the difference that can be seen in a state variable shouldn't be attributed to the fact that they're in Kansas or Oregon, only to suggest that there are regional differences in driver behavior, which is perfectly reasonable and we would expect to see from work in any numerous studies. Next, let's take a look at what we're learning from the left turn lane, the inside and outside lane. Previous work suggested that we'd see that headway to Q position trend, and also suggested that there was a difference in the flow characteristics between the two lanes, but there was little consensus on what that difference was. From this analysis, we've shown that the headways of the first 5 vehicles at those dual left turn lanes are 5% greater in the inside lane as compared to the outside lane. Greater headways are going to lead to less capacity in those inside lanes. Finally, let's take a look at the distraction, what we're all here for. So we came up with estimates for all of these distractions, and if we examine our p-values here, we can see that these distraction types, talking, manipulating the dashboard, our catch-all category, other distractions, and in fact that 7% of unknown distractions showed up as significantly different than the undistracted case. Additionally, we have cell phone use here with a smaller estimated effect and a p-value of 0.06. Now a lot of people will use a 0.05 as a cutoff for significant or insignificant, but it's really more of a spectrum. So I would say that this is suggestive of this effect of cell phone use increasing headways at signalized intersections with dual left turns. But this also leads us into an interesting case where we've shown a situation where talking to a passenger in the car is significantly more detrimental to driver performance than cell phone use. It's something like a 4-fold increase and a significant increase on the p-value there. So why does this happen? Well, if we think about what's happening with a conversation on a cell phone, you have the manual distraction of holding the cell phone to your head, and you have that cognitive distraction of holding the conversation. With an in-person conversation, you still have that same cognitive distraction, but you have a visual distraction of turning and looking at the person you're conversing with. Add on to this the fact that at a signalized intersection, you're stopped, so you may perceive it to be safe to take your eyes off the road for an extended period of time. You're going to end up with a condition where this visual distraction is going to create longer perception reaction times, and thus longer headways at these signalized intersections. Next, I'd like to go on a little thought experiment about applying the results of this analysis to some other situations. So, how is distraction affecting the startup loss time and the efficiency at a signalized intersection? Well, we previously defined the startup loss time as the sum of these incremental values above the saturation headway. And we just went through an analysis that showed distraction is increasing the headways in these first 5 Q positions. So therefore, by definition, distraction is also increasing the startup loss time. To further examine it, we should come up with a reasonable estimation for the saturation headway value. And I'm going to propose that we could do this by examining the headways of drivers in Q positions greater than 5, the data that we originally set aside and did not analyze. To do this, we first looked at the headway values between each state, since we believe there are regional differences between the states. And we took the mean value of the headway of these vehicles with Q position greater than 5. Because the saturation headway is more of a central tendency, a trend, we then discarded all the data that was greater than a standard deviation away from the mean and recalculated the mean to really hone in on what we thought that saturation headway value might be. From this, we could use the estimated headway values for the first 5 Q positions and subtract away that saturation headway value to come up with estimates of startup loss time for the 3 different states. From there, we could then examine, and that was for an undistracted driver there. From there, we could then examine the additional startup loss time we would expect to see if a queue consisted of distracted drivers. And these values here are for a queue that is entirely composed of drivers with this one distraction type. Admittedly, this isn't the most likely situation, but it could show a spectrum of possibilities between a distracted and an undistracted queue. So, from here, if we consider applying these results that we have at a do a left turn lane and say that these effects of distraction are probably similar or the same at a standard 4-leg intersection, we can examine the total amount of cycle time that is being lost due to the effects of distraction. So at this 4-leg intersection, we might have a cycle length as low as 60 seconds. If all of the drivers on all 4 of the legs were distracted by using a cell phone, they might have an increased startup loss time of 2.16 seconds, or about 3.6% of the total cycle time. And this is in addition to the already existing effects of startup loss time that there's nothing we can do to get rid of. In a more pessimistic scenario, if we looked at all of these drivers being distracted by an in-person, in-vehicle conversation, the startup loss time across these 4 legs could be almost 9.5 seconds, representing nearly 16% of the total cycle time at that intersection. So this distraction could have some pretty serious effects on the efficiency of signalized intersections. From there, I'd just like to wrap up everything with a bit of a conclusion. 4 distraction types were found to significantly increase the median headways. Additionally, there was suggestive evidence that cell phone use had an effect on the median headways. An in-person conversation was shown to increase headway nearly 4 times that of a person on a cell phone. And through our thought experiment, we were able to determine that a distracted queue might display startup loss times of half a second to nearly 2.5 seconds greater than an undistracted queue. If we applied this to the 4 legs at a signalized intersection, this additional startup loss time could be as great as 15.8% of the total cycle time. With that, I'll touch on some of the future work that could be done in the area. There's great potential to continue examining the effects of distraction on efficiency. This study has only examined one very specific lane configuration. To apply these effects to other lane configurations, you really do need to do a study that proves it is applicable to that 4-leg intersection. Additionally, the effects of distraction on efficiency could be examined in flowing traffic or at unsignalized intersections. With that, I'll just throw up the references for the record. And again, I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. David Hurwitz, my entire committee, all of my co-conspirators in grad school, and some of the people that helped fund me, and of course, my awesome wife. Are there any questions?
Where did you get the photos from?
It's actually from a German transportation agency.
In your model, you did not consider the vehicle type for the headway, but I assume that also has an effect on the headway, right?
Yes, we didn't consider that because there wasn't much we could do about the vehicle type. Also, the data was primarily passenger cars. We didn't have a lot of heavy truck traffic. The amount of trucks that's starting to get to a pretty small sample size when you're actually looking at those trucks. Justin?
I mean,
consider thinking about possibly breaking it down into those three main distraction types: cognitive, visual, and manual? And thinking about, like, do you think with that data it'd be possible to actually get into which of those distraction types contributes the most to that lost time?
I think that method could be taken, but I'm apprehensive. First, it's going to be hard to split many of the distractions neatly into one of those three categories. So I think by running the individual distractions and then more qualitatively examining which distractions have an effect and thinking about how those distractions happen from a human factor standpoint, I think that's going to be the most fruitful way to examine that data.
Did you make a distinction between hands-on cell phone use and hands-free cell phone use?
To be completely honest, there probably is some hands-free cell phone use, but we weren't able to detect that from the video footage. It's a pretty small device, and with the distance away from the car, we're not able to see that. There are quite a few good studies out there to show that the use of the hand is not the major distraction in a conversation. It's actually holding that conversation, having that cognitive load on the brain.
So in other words, hands-free really doesn't
No,
sound...
it's chrome. It's just like
It's a placebo.
The last synthesis that was done, there have been something like 86 studies of handheld versus hands-free cell phone just in driving simulators, and universally they couldn't detect any statistical difference between the two. It's that cognitive engagement in a conversation that really drives the performance degradation, which is fascinating when we look at the laws that are currently in place. So the banning of a handheld cell phone, all of the research suggests that has no positive safety implication whatsoever.
So really it is a placebo. It just makes us feel good.
It sure does. Any other general questions from students or members of the committee?
I have a few questions. When you divide the different type of distractions, so if I'm using a cell phone talking, that's just a cell phone use, right? And that's easier to identify. How do you identify the people are, cognitive distraction?
That's a good point. From this study, we were only able to examine people who were distracted through visual search. So it was high definition video. If you were talking to the passenger, turning your head, perhaps even the presence of that passenger, we considered that to be a distraction. If we saw you with that cell phone, we considered that to be the distraction. But there are certainly many, many distractions that we could not determine. If there was a distracting event outside the vehicle, there's no way we're going to be able to determine that from the video footage. It would be nice, but I have trouble coming up with a methodology where I can truly capture every distraction type.
And can you go back a little bit to the regression model? The one that's showing the median highway with exactly a linear combination of the different.
That one?
Yeah, this one. What was the motivation of putting that Oregon data and Utah data in this regression equation?
So these are dummy variables. Oregon will have a value of 1 if it's in Oregon and a value of 0 otherwise. These are in here to account for the variability in the data that exists due to the regional differences in driving behavior. And of course, we don't see Kansas in there because it's been set at the reference level. I could set Oregon or Utah as the reference level and rerun the analysis. But there's really no benefit. I mean, if you're interested in comparing Oregon to Utah, there's a benefit. But we just have to set some reference level to compare against when we're using the dummy variables in the regression analysis.
Let me see. I was actually wondering whether can be another way. For example, just use one location in the regression model and use the model to sort of like predict another location's behavior. Is that something doable?
It's certainly something we could try. We have the data, we can easily segregate it. We could run the same model. We could run an Oregon-only model and then try to apply that to the Utah and Kansas data. And although I haven't run that analysis, I think you would see some significant results. Obviously, that piece of regional behavior won't be there, and will add some noise to the signal, but I think you'll still be able to see a pretty strong signal there.
Why did you use median?
You have to use the median once you use the log transform, because we've changed the data. Inherently, we've changed the data, but we haven't changed the order of the data. So once we do this log transform, they kind of take away mean from us. We don't get to use it anymore because it's no longer valid. But since the order of the data hasn't changed, we can still talk about the median. And with a data set of some 4,000, in light of the central tendency theory, we're still going to say that that's a reasonable predictor of an average headway.
So who were your collaborators at each of the other universities?
Our collaborators work.
So at Utah State, it was Dr. Kevin Heaslip,
Right.
and at the University of Kansas, it was Dr. Stephen Schrock.
Okay, so their students collected the data. You were not?
No, I was not actually involved in the data collection process. I'd like to give a big thanks to Halston Tuss and Sahar. I'm going to butcher her last name if I try. For actually collecting the data and doing a large part of the data reduction too. Yeah.
So all your data were collected from college town, like you say interstate and Kansas State, from those college towns. Did bicycle or pedestrian have any restriction on the data, or your data set were included in bicycle or pedestrian also? Like bicycle
No.
or something like that?
No, we didn't include any non-motorized vehicles or pedestrians, and we did not count pedestrians or bicyclists as a distraction to the motor vehicle operators. Did that answer the question there?
Yeah.
Just kind of along those lines, would it, if there was a distraction related to a pedestrian or bicyclist, would that go under the other category then? Like, what were some of the other?
If it was clear that there was a distraction that was caused outside of the vehicle, it would fall into that other category. If you look at the breakdown of distractions from crash data, I think 30% of distractions identified in crash data made up collectively less than 1% each of identifiable distractions. So there's as many different distractions as you can really think up to do in your car. Trumpet playing, for example, or I believe David's favorite one he ever saw was a guitar. Sure was. As a pizza delivery driver, I'm guilty of some pretty wild distractions too. Yes, those would fall under the other category.
So is there any data with regard to accidents, or rather crashes in general, that implicates talking as a significant contributor?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if that connection has been made. Definitely they've shown that the conversation is the distracting factor, and that distractions do lead to higher crash frequencies. I don't know if they've proven in a very rigorously statistical sense that last little link, though.
I was just thinking, we encourage high occupancy vehicles, but maybe there's more conversations going on in such
Well, if
cases.
you think about it, an in-person conversation has to be one of the oldest driver distractions ever in existence.
It is one of the reasons when you think about graduated licensing, So very new drivers are only allowed to, well, it depends on where you are in the country, maybe only allowed to travel with a sibling or a parent, certainly aren't allowed to drive their friends around. So that minimizes the amount of conversation in one element that can be taking place at any one time.
Certainly between kids and their parents.
Makes for less fun to say.
Robbie, did you have a question?
Yeah, I wonder if you consider driver's age, the age of that first driver in the queue, waiting in the queue.
We
That
do have age, but only as identified from the video footage. I frankly didn't have a lot of faith in the classification of age that was taken from the video, so I didn't analyze it.
And that's a pretty common limitation of these empirical sort of visual inspections out in the field. So we typically collect age in some aggregate level and then tend not to analyze it because we don't have a lot of faith in the quality of those observations.
Following up with Dr. Bell's question a bit, it seems like most distraction research is focused on crash statistics, where you're looking at headway and, a challenge is how can we make our transportation system more efficient. So a study like this, you can see, make inroads into that. Is this an active research area looking into distraction types and efficiency of the transportation system, or?
There's really not a lot going on right now, but we're hoping that there will be more.
It's pretty fun. We just got this paper accepted to the ASCE Journal of Transportation Engineering, and the comments from the reviewers and some subsequent comments on the B Community website for ITE said that they've never seen anything in this space, and that was a nice contribution to the national discussion. So we're hoping to build an area in this topic.
If you want to get into the really nitpicky details of how to time a signal, this increased headways due to distraction is going to play into your passage time that you're going to set, so that you may need to increase your passage time if you expect drivers to be distracted to avoid signals prematurely gapping out and not serving the standing queue.
One more question. I'm working on a headway, vehicle type specific headway in work zone. So it's a different setting, not considering about those type of eating or stuff. Maybe people are using stuff, but that's not recorded in the data. Just from the empirical data side. But for this one, from your data set, do you have the empirical headway? You know what I mean? Do you have can you capture the empirical data of the headway? And this one, you get a headway is a function of these variables.
So what we've done to collect the headway is take the timestamp on the footage. So we've collected, you can see right here, crossing the stop bar.
Yes, I know that.
So I guess I'm not fully understanding your question.
You have a large data set, right? And for vehicle arriving to the intersection and the headway, you can get the headway from the video data, right?
Yes.
If you have a larger sample size, then you can sort of come up with just like Robbie's question, like vehicle type specific. If you have that, that would be a very valuable data set. I haven't seen any study about the headway, the vehicle type specific headway distribution to the signalized intersection. Because this is important because when we simulate vehicles arrival to the signalized intersection, how do we generate a vehicle? We use headway distribution, but right now we do not have a lot of empirical studies support that.
Yeah, that's a really cool point. So these would be discharge headways, they're not arrival headways. So that's going to be a little bit different when we think about the two model. Yeah, so this will be the headways of the discharging queue. Okay, so with that, I want to thank everyone for spending a little bit of time with us. Let's go ahead and give Pat a round of applause. So I would encourage encourage everyone to take another taste. There are obviously some fantastic desserts, and we'll excuse all of the non-committee members. And thanks so much for donating a little bit of your time this afternoon.
Thank you all.
Brought to you by Global Conglomeration Company.